is crime? Seems obvious, right? Crime occurs when someone breaks the law. But why are laws the way that they are? Another obvious question. Laws codify what people decide is wrong in society and codify the responses to those ills. Well, what is right? What is wrong? And how do you know the difference between right and wrong? If something is wrong, is there a clear opposite? Why aren't the answers to these questions straightforward? When we start thinking about questions like these, we discover that there are shades of gray when we talk about crime, deviance, and what wrong is. I know you signed up to learn about crime and criminality, but before we can get there, we need to understand politics. We'll talk about how politics is part of our everyday lives in the next video with my buddy Luis de Vigna. But before I send you there, I'm going to tell you a story that might challenge your thinking of good and evil, right and wrong. Not so long ago, an 85-year-old man was on the sidewalk. He had fallen down during his nightly walk in the busy Parisian neighborhood where he lived. Despite it being a high-traffic area, no one passing by checked on him for 9 hours. Then a homeless person saw him, checked on him, and called for help. It was too late. Hypothermia had set in, and so, that day, René Robert, a Swiss photographer famous for his shots of some of Spain's most well-known flamenco stars, died. He was effectively killed by the indifference of the people walking past him. No one was bothered to consider why a man who was crumpled on the pavement might need to be checked on. Who, if anyone, should be held accountable for René Robert's death? Nobody did anything illegal. Only a homeless person, a person who lived in the margins of society, was concerned enough to check on him. Parisians were outraged. How could an old man die like that, alone, on the street? How could society allow the unthinkable to happen? However, as one observer pointed out, the outrage being expressed was for René Robert, a respected member of society. In France, 600 people die on the streets every year. In Australia, 5% of homeless people die on the streets each year. And these people die alone, and no collective outrage is expressed. Everyday, well-meaning people are comfortable with ignoring the margins of society. What does that make us? Is our indifference towards those in the margins right or wrong? Whatever our indifference may be, it's definitely not illegal. Judge not, that you be not judged. And yet we judge all the time. The crumpled old man on the sidewalk, for many, was a homeless person who required no attention. Politicians, elected to represent us and our values, judge on our behalf by creating rules and shaping punishments that are handed out when those rules are violated. Click on the next video to see exactly how politics informs so much of how we live our lives. Joining me today is Dr. Luis de Vigna. He's a political scientist who has worked as a public employee in Portugal. He's also been involved in party politics there too. These days, he studies how politics influence foreign policy decision-making. He's going to help us understand how politics are part of the fabric of everyday life. So, Luis, before we get started, I know you're from New Jersey. How does it feel to be from a place that's not New York?
I'm actually pretty proud to be from New Jersey. You know, if you've ever seen the Jersey Shore, you've seen that anyone would be proud to belong to that, a community of well-educated, respectful, and a hardworking group of individuals. So, yeah, I'm quite happy being from New Jersey and not New York.
So I know politics is something that people debate all the time in their everyday lives. Everyone has a position. They like to talk about politics this, politics that. But actually, politics is everything, isn't it?
Yes, I would say we do tend to talk about politics as big picture things, politics with capital P. But if we think about it, politics does influence almost everything we do in our daily lives. Let me give you an example of my life, how politics affects sometimes the most minute things. For example, I woke up this morning and I heard the garbage truck coming and picking up the bins, right? Because it's trash day. So if you think about it, these things are regulated by political institutions that are run by political decision makers.
Well, what kind of regulations with trash are there? I mean, it's trash.
It's trash.
Don't you just throw it away?
It's trash, but ultimately what gets thrown where, what gets separated, the recycling, what time, what days you put, all of that is regulated by political institutions. It's not, you can't just put the bin out on, at least on my street on Wednesday, right? You'd probably get fined.
And we've also seen a big change in terms of how trash is, right? Because when you and I were kids, there was no recycling bin, there was no green waste bin, right? Like that was just not part of how you threw things away. You put everything in the same bin and it was picked up. Now you actually can't do that.
Yes, definitely. When I grew up, you could just toss it out into the street pretty much. I'm from New Jersey, right? So we would just toss it out into the street. And you're right. This is environmental issues have really made it to the forefront of the political agenda. So today we're much more judicious in the way that we deal with our waste. So you're exactly right. Again, political actors now regulate this sort of activity, and and we're much more conscious of what we do with our waste.
Okay, so what else? What else in society is
So
regulated?
I'm waking up. The first thing I do then is usually turn on the light, and if you think about it, the electricity that I'm getting is highly regulated. It's either provided directly by a public institution or it's probably outsourced to a private company, but regulated. Once again, environmental concerns are probably involved there. Then I'm going to go I'll have my cereals. The amount of sugar in the milk is going to be regulated by government agencies. Then I'll have my toast. The amount of salt that we have in bread is regulated by political institutions. And then if you think about it, I usually take a shower after that. The water, who's providing the water? The amount of content, chemicals, and other elements that can be present in the water are regulated by political actors. Then I'll usually take the bus or the car here to the university. The roads, how fast, the speed limit is defined.
And I don't understand how this is not a bigger political issue because traffic here moves like molasses, right? Like, I mean, can we get a few New Jersey politicians coming in here and changing the speed limit so
Right.
we can actually drive at a reasonable speed?
I would think so. 60 miles an hour I don't think is that
60
much.
miles an hour? You're joking. It's 60K. That's like 40 miles an hour.
Oh, it's kilometers. Then that would explain some tickets that I have. But anyways, with that said, then I get to the university. And if you think about it, the university, especially for students' educational experience is highly regulated by it is governmental institutions or political institutions that say how many credits a degree it will have, what the fees are, what accreditation is necessary to. So a student's educational experience, like our educational experience, highly regulated and determined by political institutions. Then I'll leave, and if we go to a coffee shop or a supermarket, what time they can open, what time they can close, what they can sell, can they sell alcohol or not, etc. All of these things, again, are usually determined and regulated by political institutions.
And we see that they vary a lot, right? Because here in this state, if you want to buy alcohol, you have got to go to the liquor store just to get things like beer, wine, anything. You can't buy it at the grocery store. But, in most places in the United States and other states here in Australia, you can often go to a grocery store and you can buy, your booze.
Yes.
So we see that, there's a lot of local differences and a lot of different people who are making decisions that are not necessarily high-level national, international actors, right?
Yeah, usually it's the bureaucracy, the public bureaucracy. When I was in public administration in Portugal, I was not a top decision maker, but I would be, providing them with suggestions. In the case, I used to work in planning and development, and I would be saying, here, we should implement these regulations or these measures because I think they're a good idea. Hopefully based on solid evidence, but probably wasn't always the case. But then again, I go home, maybe I want to have a party. There's probably going to be a local or state ordinance, probably a local ordinance on, how loud the music can be. There's going to be certain decibels that you can't surpass.
Yeah,
They'll
that's
tell
funny.
you what time you have to turn that down, right?
Well, it's funny you should say that, right? Because when I was an undergraduate in New Orleans, you had to call a police officer if you want to throw a party at the frat house, right? And the cops would park out in front of the house, and they would just sit there. And I suppose they were there if something went haywire. But there was a certain time, I think 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, where they had to cut the party off. And, the cop came and knocked on the door and said, the party's over. And then you had to cut everything off. All the booze had to move inside the house. No more music, nothing. And the party was disbanded. It was really quite something. But, I've never lived anywhere else where that was the case. I've also never lived anywhere else where you can drink liquor in an open container on the sidewalk. God, I miss New Orleans.
Yeah. In most of the U.S., for example, growing up in New Jersey, if you were taking liquor out of a liquor store or a bar, it would have to go in a container or a paper bag or something. Again, because political institutions and political decision makers, deem that is.
So you're telling me the paper bag is inherently a political issue?
The paper bag, it was a political issue because you would get fined if you were caught with open and exposed, beer bottle or any kind of alcohol. At least when I was growing up in the 80s, and I know this is true because my dad owned a bar, so I was quite aware of the law at the time. But also in other miscellaneous things, if you think about it, political institutions and political actors will determine, for example, how old you have to be to quit school. The mandatory number of years you have to go to school or complete. If you think about it, how old you are to drink, how old you have to be to drive, how old you have to be to vote, how old you have to be to rent a hotel room. Ultimately, how old you have to have sex with someone legally. So if you think about it, the politics with the small p really permeates our day to day. So, politics, as you said, is everything.
A lot of folks like to think about crime as a black and white issue, something which is definitive. It's either right or it's wrong. But you study international relations, you study foreign policy, and the questions of right and wrong are certainly inherent to the things that you study. How does this come about? Who determines what right and wrong is, and how does that change over time?
Yeah. In foreign policy and international relations more generally, I'm just going to go back 100 years. What's considered right in international relations today, is very different than what was considered right 100 years ago. If you think about it, let me give you an example. In the early 20th century was when we had the first attempts to outlaw war, because it was accepted that countries could take what they wanted by force. Today, we have a whole host of international institutions that deem that's not acceptable. There's a whole host of human rights or international human rights regime that sort of says every individual, regardless, of their gender, regardless of their age, their religion, their, political affiliation, et cetera, has certain rights, just as a human being, 90 years ago, that was something that didn't exist. So, what's acceptable today is very different than what was acceptable or considered correct in the past. I think that's just normal. And really, if you think about it, you said who determines this? I would say, obviously, they're in the international relations field or in international politics, it's usually states. And when I say states, I usually mean the nation state as the key player, but also international institutions. And then in my field of study, because theory is very important in this, we'll see that some theorists, mainly in what's called the realist camp, will say it's those states that are more powerful are capable of imposing certain rules and enforcing them. But then we'll see, for example, liberal scholars and others saying, no, some of these institutions are also really important in developing these rules and disseminating these rules. And what's really interesting, I think, over the last 60 to 70 years is the role that these institutions have played in allowing sometimes smaller actors, smaller states, non-state actors such as NGOs and other sorts of organizations to come in to the decision-making sphere to sort of generate a collective decision-making, or as good as it's going to get, understanding how international politics works. So yes, I think things really vary. Even democracy. What we consider democracy in Australia or the United States or Europe is quite different than how democracy is interpreted in other places. For example, just at the end of last year, China published a document on how they define democracy.
That was 2021.
2021, but their conception of democracy is quite different than ours. Is one right or the other one wrong? No, it's just different interpretations. Obviously, in this case, I think there's some political objectives there, but this just to say, one of the things you learn, especially in political science, and I think in social sciences in general, is there's really no absolute truths and definitive truths, at least.
Well, maybe I can push back because it seems like those who have a lot of power are the ones who are most able to make the rules and do the things that they want to do.
Yes, that would be true. I would say, though, it depends on regime, on regime types. I think one of the interesting features, if you want, or dynamics of the last, I'm going to say the last century, is we've seen in liberal democracies an attempt to broaden the capacity or the space for individuals to participate in the political process, in the decision-making process. And especially today, where especially societies such as, in our case, the US or in Europe or in Australia, societies are changing. They're more diverse. And there's this acknowledgement that, all of the actors have to be able to participate and pursue their interests, within an open political process. Other regimes will see that that's not the case. They're only a small group, usually, of very powerful individuals or elites are capable of really defining politics and defining the political agenda. I would add, though, that even in societies such as ours, there's a lot of research that does show that even though everyone has theoretical access to the political process, we do know that there are certain asymmetries. We do know that research, in the case of the United States, shows that individuals who are wealthier, corporations, big corporations, do have a bigger role in political decision making, an oversized influence in the political process. I think that has a lot to do also with institutional factors. But in theory, what we'll see is in societies like ours, there's an attempt to include a greater number of individuals within the decision-making process, which I think is a sign of a healthy democracy.
Okay, one of the things that I think we've noticed in our lifetimes is how society changes and what is considered to be right and wrong, or the appropriate rules in order to govern a situation have changed quite a lot. In our lifetimes, I think smoking is one of the best examples of that, right? Certainly, culturally, smoking has been a thing which has been very different in the places that we've lived, right? Certainly in Europe, smoking was far more acceptable up until more recently compared to the United States, and certainly compared to here. We see this with all sorts of changes in terms of how cigarettes are taxed. We also see it in terms of who is contributing to the discussion and making the rules in terms of smoking. So how does this actually work in terms of politics, right? Is this really a political thing, or are we seeing that politics gets parked to public health? What's going on?
Listen, I grew up in the 1970s and 1980s. And I was a smoker for many years. And when I was smoking, in the late 1980s, very young, I knew what the health risks were. The Marlboro Man was on TV, and, Marlboro had advertisement in Formula One and all these things. But we knew, I think the studies were out there. But really, political decision makers in the case of the United States were reluctant to regulate it or place greater restrictions on access to cigarettes.
Why was that?
Probably because at the time, opposition to cigarettes, and I'm going to call it that for lack of a better name, was not as involved as they have been over the years. The capacity to influence decision makers, more groups being able to be involved in the political process. One of the things I do admire in the United States, I don't know in Australia, it was certainly not like this when I was in Europe, was it's quite easy for me to pick up, I used to live in North Dakota, even though I'm originally from New Jersey, pick up the phone and talk to my senator or my representative. Usually if you pick up the phone, it's not going to be the senator, but for example, I had contact with Heidi Heitkamp's office back in the day because I needed something, and they solved it. So I think that wouldn't have happened, or it would have been more difficult 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. So I do think today also there's a greater openness to all of these actors participating. And I do think in the case of cigarettes, groups associated with public health, with children's health, anti-tobacco lobby, if you want, has found a way to participate and to sway politicians. And you're right, when I arrived in Europe in 1993, and for many years I would smoke in the university, I would smoke in my office at work, Only somewhere, I'm going to say, in the early 2000s was it prohibited in public
Yeah,
in
and
public
I
settings.
remember that because there was a debate there, even though there was the public health issue. The counterpoint was that it was going to be bad for business. People weren't going to show up to the
Yeah.
bar. They weren't going to spend their money. They weren't going to be as happy when they go out. And that turned into a pretty politically charged issue. I think there were referendums in some cases. But at the end of the day, we see that in most European countries, smoking is now prohibited in bars and clubs, just like it is here in Australia. And we've seen that higher taxes have been implemented in order to diminish the appeal to younger people by increasing the cost of cigarettes, right?
I do think and in Europe, I remember at the time, like I was still a smoker at the time, it was people being more involved in the political process and being more active in fighting for what they believe is right. And ultimately, we've already mentioned it, there is an asymmetry of power with access to the political process. But if you do get enough people on board, if you do get enough groups on board, you can ultimately have a fighting chance of changing legislation. And I think in the case of cigarettes, that was quite successful against the tobacco companies and other entrenched interests at the time.
I think one of the other things that's really important is just how politicized rulemaking in terms of the carceral system is, criminal justice system is, right? Because we've seen big changes in our lifetimes. I think of things like interracial marriage, right? That was something that impacted my parents. When my parents were born, interracial marriage was illegal. In fact, a white person could not marry a black person. That only changed in the 1950s in the United States, if I'm not mistaken. Those regulations were here in Australia too, where Aboriginal people didn't necessarily have the right to marry who they wanted, particularly if they're marrying outside of their communities. And so we see that that was a time where rules were very, very different compared to the norms that we accept today. And we see many different examples. Abortion, we see examples like drug use, even. We see examples like gender, gay marriage, right? We have all of these rules that have changed as a part of political pressure, political process. But there's still a lot of people who are effectively excluded from the political process. Certainly when we think of criminal justice, particularly in the United States, once somebody has a felony conviction, in many states, they can, even after they serve their sentences, they can never regain
Voting.
their right to vote. Exactly. And so they can never regain the capacity to be full-blown citizens.
Yeah.
So when we start thinking about the politics of this, what are the types of things that we need to consider?
Reading some stuff and having at the time in the United States to every once in a while interact with my colleagues who were working in criminology. For example, African American population is about 12 to 13%, I think, of the overall population, but it's completely represented on the other end of the spectrum in terms of incarceration, right? Same thing with Latinos, etc. So you're exactly right. I do think the first thing is understanding that there are structural issues there, right? It's been shown in a couple of studies when I used to teach American government, and I would talk about some of these issues. I would show like the if you could have two individuals born same building, same street, same building, one white, the other one black, go to the same school, have the same upbringing, the probability that the white student would have a more successful life, economic life, etc., was significantly higher than the black individual, right? So there's some structural issues there, and we're generalizing obviously because we look at large statistical numbers. But I think you're right. But I do think there has been this recognition in large part of the society. I think what happens a lot of times is society moves forward and accepts things before political institutions. If we know anything about institutions, is they're bureaucratic in nature, and bureaucracies tend to be very resistant to change. So I do think a lot of times society has moved on, accepts certain things, has certain views, considers certain things correct, other things incorrect, but it's harder to move political institutions just because there are certain interests that are highly entrenched that become a little bit more difficult. The payoff sometimes for them it isn't worth change. I think we have moved forward, and you're exactly right. I have seen transformations in the United States and Europe, especially in all the issues you spoke about and some others, that we've made more change maybe in 50 to 60 years than we probably did for quite a few centuries. Are we at a point where I think most of us are satisfied? I would say no, right? But I do think one of the things we do have, and I'm always happy when I say I've lived in the United States, I've lived in Europe, I live in Australia, I've always lived in societies where there is access to the political process, right? Again, there's asymmetries, but I feel comfortable that if I need to take a position, speak to my local representative or my state representative, or ultimately write a letter to my national representative, that I can have a voice and I can organize with people who share common values and interests and try to change the political process. No guarantees that I'll be successful at all, but at least I have that capacity. Whereas there's a larger part of the world population that cannot say the same thing, right? So their space for improvement is still much greater.
And there are certainly populations within the communities that we've lived in that are systematically excluded
Definitely.
from those political processes. You mentioned African American people in the United States. I mean, the incarceration rates of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here in Australia are shameful, right? They're the single most incarcerated population in the Western world. So I think this is a problem that we have to be aware of, that we have to understand that it has, like you said, structural impacts, and that influences the way that life unfolds. At the end of the day, politics isn't everything that we see, and how it influences us is something that we have to be quite aware of, whether we're talking about international relations, foreign policy, or they're talking about domestic politics and the carceral system. Louis, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate your time.
Yes, sir. Always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Politics is part of almost everything we do in our day-to-day lives. Unsurprisingly, politics also plays a role in how crime and justice are defined. To illustrate this point, let me tell you about my friend Josephine. Here we are together in this photo with her mom. We're rocking the old school connection here. Josephine was about 42 years old at the time of this photograph. At this time, she had spent nearly 20 years of her life incarcerated. And for what? When she was 18 years old, her boyfriend gave her heroin and they used together. One day, the two of them were arrested. The police found wholesale quantities of drugs in their house. Josephine's boyfriend was facing a lengthy prison sentence, so she took the charge. Why on earth would she do that? Because it would have been another felony strike for her boyfriend, another step closer to life imprisonment. In the United States, 3 felony strikes and you're out, forever. Americans love their sports and their sports analogies, and the 3 strikes rule was part of a larger tough-on-crime narrative that had emerged in the U.S. in the 1980s. It still has its proponents today, not only there, but elsewhere in the world, like here in Australia. The first 3 strikes law was signed into law by Bill Clinton in 1994. It was considered a marquee achievement for the president at the time. So Josephine took one for her man to keep him out of prison. It landed her a sentence of 8 years. 4 years in, she'd be released. She spent her 19th, 20th, 21st, and 22nd birthdays all in a prison cell. While other women her age were in college, working jobs, flirting with boys, and thinking of a future, Josephine was surviving in prison, learning the rules of the carceral system that was now her home. After 4 years, she got out and was placed on parole, supervised release. The conditions were get a job, find a place to live, avoid booze and drugs. Yet, she, like many of her siblings, had become addicted to heroin. And in this world, addiction was a moral failing that was to be punished and not a disease to be treated. She relapsed, pissed dirty, and was sent back to prison. She wouldn't face any more serious charges in her lifetime, but that pattern of release, relapse, and return to prison repeated itself for the next 20 years. She was more of a threat to herself than to society, but the system did what it was designed to do. America was fighting, after all, a war on drugs. This war had been launched by Richard Nixon years before and expanded by Ronald Reagan as a part of his tough-on-crime stance. It was a war that would span the world. But locally, the enemy was more than just the big kingpins who are immortalized in shows like Narcos. Anyone who used and didn't have a lawyer to explain away their missteps was a target in that war's dragnet. How do you feel about Josephine? Did Josephine deserve to go to prison? Certainly, she broke the law. She violated the rules. She knew that she was violating the rules. Breaking the rules. It's something that society doesn't like very much. Yet, how bad was Josephine's behavior? Does it warrant being locked up for 20 years? Why? Is it justice? Next, we need to ask about the role of prison. Was being sent to prison the best outcome for Josephine, her child, and for society? Going to prison never helped her kick heroin. Going to prison never gave her daughter a mom. We'll return to Josephine's story another day, but we need to realize that what happened to Josephine isn't a uniquely American phenomenon. The second most common reason why people are locked up in Australia is for drug offenses. The complexities of these issues make studying criminology fascinating. In our next video, we'll have a look at what the study of criminology involves. What exactly is criminology? I like to describe it as the sociology of deviance, but that's too simplistic. Criminology also includes the study of antisocial behavior, regulated activities, crime, politics, consequences of being victimized, and all sorts of other issues that we'll see as this semester progresses. Part of the difficulty in defining criminology is that it is a relatively new discipline. It has roots in a lot of other intellectual traditions, perhaps most notably sociology. In fact, next week, when we start talking about theory, we'll be looking at folks who would have more likely called themselves sociologists rather than criminologists. The first university departments dedicated specifically to the study of criminology appeared in the 20th century. The people who formed them were folks trained in other disciplinary traditions, but they had a common interest in crime, deviance, and victimization. But even before these criminology departments were formed, some places already focused on the study of crime. The most famous of these was the University of Chicago, where a critical mass of sociologists were studying crime in the early part of the 20th century. We'll talk about the Chicago School later in the semester. If you look around the world, you'll see that a lot of different people study questions related to crime, deviance, victimization, and there is no single way to define the study of these topics or the people who study them. Getting in on the action are sociologists, economists, political scientists, psychologists, penologists, and victimologists. They bring their own perspectives, theoretical frameworks, and methods to the problems that they study. One of the central issues that we study as criminologists is, perhaps unsurprisingly, crime. But what is crime? You might say that crime is essentially a violation of the law, but is that enough? There are a lot of questions that we should be asking about why something is a crime in the first place. How can we tell what a crime is? Who decides what a crime is? How do people decide what a crime is? And why do people make the decisions they make in terms of what crime is? Defining the terms we use is important. When we talk about concepts like crime, we need to understand that not everyone shares our definition. Think of differences in definitions of words in your ordinary life. Let's have a look at one very contentious term, spicy. How do you define spicy? Are you like some of my Northern European friends who think that too much black pepper constitutes spicy food? Are you like my Indian cousins who use all kinds of seasonings and peppers in their cooking but have special designations for really spicy things like vindaloo? Are you like my Nigerian friends who ask for more spicy when it comes to the suicide wings? Imagine having these three groups of people come together to establish a shared definition of spicy. It's not an easy task. Everyone's experiences are different, so relying on personal experience presents challenges. We might be able to measure the heat of the peppers using a scale, like the Scoville scale. But then, what do Scoville measurements mean to everyday people? The challenges we face in understanding and defining spicy and communicating what that means are the same challenges we face when defining terms that we work with in our academic inquiry. So let's go back to thinking about what crime is. There are lots of definitions of what crime is. Which definition of crime should we use as academics? Let's consider our options. Option number 1, the dictionary definition. The Macquarie Dictionary defines crime in 4 ways. First, crime is an act committed or omission of duty, injurious to public welfare, for which punishment is prescribed by law, imposed by judicial proceedings usually brought in the name of the state. Second, crime is a serious violation of human law, steeped in crime. Third, crime is any offense, especially one of grave character. Fourth, crime is a serious wrongdoing, a sin. These are all definitions that we might agree on sometimes, but they raise a bunch of questions. What happens if a law is unjust? What is a human law? What is a sin? The concept of crime gets pretty messy pretty fast. Okay, so let's have a look at option number 2, the legal definition of crime. A legal definition of crime requires 2 elements to be proved. First, there has to be mens rea. Mens rea translates to guilty mind. A mental or fault element is at play. Second, there has to be actus reus. Actus reus translates to guilty act. An external or behavioral element must have happened. Okay, these legal concepts establish a rigid definition of what a crime is and how it can be proved, but it's a little too restrictive in terms of what determines what we, as criminologists, ought to study. After all, we're concerned about deviance and its impacts in society. As criminologists, we have to think about rules, how they are formed, how they are enforced. We also have to consider how rules, along with their formation and their enforcement, change over time. Let's have a look at how our society views some actions today and compare them to societies of the past. Let's first consider how morals have changed. Consider conduct like pedophilia and incestuous relationships. While illegal in most countries today, that hasn't always been the case. Not so long ago, marriage happened when people were a lot younger, when the bride and groom hit puberty. This was in part due to low life expectations. A 20-year-old man who marries a 14-year-old girl would have been normal 3 or 4 centuries ago. Heck, in Australia, the marriageable age in Australian states and territories was the same for the age of consent, 14 for men and 12 for women, and that was true up until the 1940s. That only changed throughout the country in 1961. Certainly, such an arrangement today is considered unacceptable in most communities and deemed pedophilia. Norms and standards change, and this is one of the inherent difficulties in terms of studying crime over time. Let's look at another example where moral views have shifted, incestuous relationships. Take, for instance, the term blue blood. Ring a bell? It's a term that describes a person of noble birth. Royals in marrying cousins often engaged in incestuous relationships, interbreeding much in the same way that bloodlines of prized dogs are bred. As a result, some genetic traits are not only passed down, but also amplified, with pale, nearly transparent skin being one such trait. In most contemporary Western contexts, incestuous relationships are considered taboo. Though, interestingly enough, this taboo drives massive business in pornography. Second, let's think about massive shifts in social and economic contexts. Some of these changes have happened in my parents' or grandparents' lifetimes. Some of these changes might have even happened in your lifetime. Let's consider 3 areas: child labor, abortion, and homosexual relationships. At the turn of the last century, now that's the 20th century I'm referring to, child labor was still commonplace in the Western world. Children commonly went to work under the age of 10. When people led largely rural existences, this work would be for the family on a farm. As industrialization occurred and folks migrated to cities, this work shifted to factories and was considerably more dangerous. Children were used because their little hands and bodies could reach into the machinery and manipulate the small components. And if their little hands got lopped off, well, that was just a bad break for them. Of course, the reality was complicated. The age of employment was 10, and children were supposed to go to school. But parents in need of food would lie about their kid's age in order to get the child to work earlier than the age of 10. Employers didn't ask for proof of age. So there were lots of issues at play that drove this reality, like a lack of a living wage, the increase of single mothers, and a lack of access to birth control. For many, life was horrible to the point that early death was a blessing. But the shifts in terms of ensuring that children had to be in school would be a driving force that resulted in a decrease of child labor in Western countries. Today, child labor exists in many countries, with children entering the workforce to do backbreaking work for little pay. However, in Australia, child labor has been restricted since the 1870s. In this respect, Australia was ahead of a lot of the rest of the industrializing world. The fact that all of you are at university is a function of these societal shifts. 100 years ago, most of you would be laboring, and none of you would be taught by someone of my complexion. Now, let's consider abortion. This is a topic that has been in the news in my home country since well before I was born. Abortion was legalized in 1973, but conservatives have been fighting to overturn that decision ever since. Abortion in Australia was decriminalized far later, with Western Australia being the first state to do so. That was in 1998. South Australia was the last state to do so. That was only in 2021. There is still some political movement geared towards rolling back access to abortion in Australia, but so far it has not been as successful as the American efforts. The debate about abortion and women's rights more broadly is one of moral and social changes. Abortion proponents view it as healthcare, whereas opponents view it as murder. The politics make agreeing to a common definition of abortion difficult, though there is definitely an unambiguous medical definition for abortion: the expulsion of a fetus from the uterus before it has reached the stage of viability. Finally, let's consider homosexual relationships. Homosexual relationships have been historically criminalized, often throughout the world. Even today, in some countries, homosexual relationships remain illegal. In 13 countries, engaging in homosexual activities is punishable by death. Besides execution, gay folks have been subjected to awful punishments, including castration. One famous example is mathematician Alan Turing. Turing, along with his team, cracked the Enigma machine that the Nazis used to send coded messages to each other in World War II. This breakthrough shifted the balance of power during the war, but 7 short years after being lauded as a war hero in 1952, Turing was chemically castrated for engaging in homosexual acts. 2 years later, he ate an apple laced with cyanide. He would be pardoned in 2013, some 60 years after his conviction and death. It took a long time for society to change its views on the activities Turing engaged in his private life. In 1972, South Australia became the first state in Australia to decriminalize homosexual acts. Tasmania was the last state to decriminalize gay men. That happened in 1997. 20 years later, the right to marry in Australia would no longer be determined by sex or gender. So yeah, we can see how society changes, and the rules that are in effect in a society can and do change, maybe slowly, over time. We can also see how right and wrong shifts over time as we consider societal and economic shifts. This complicates the study of crime and criminality. Finally, let's think about political contexts and how they determine whether an action is a crime. Let's think about an awful act: murder. Murder is wrong, right? Is it always a crime? In short, no. It turns out there are many circumstances where killing someone is not a crime. Context matters. Some contexts seem reasonable, self-defense, for instance. But that raises the question, how do we define self-defense? Some states in the United States allow folks to stand their own ground. That means in those states people can use deadly force when threatened. Taken to the extreme, the use of deadly force can have tragic results. Take, for example, the case of former SWAT commander Curtis Reeves, who killed a man in a movie theater after that man threw his phone and some popcorn at him. Apparently, Curtis Reeves, who had never fired his gun in the line of duty, found this dude, armed with popcorn and a cell phone, to be the scariest person he had ever met. He feared for his life. He shot the man. A jury acquitted him of murder. Or maybe consider the case of George Zimmerman, who was scared of a teenager in a hoodie and shot Trayvon Martin to death. For doing what? Being suspicious? The legal process found Zimmerman innocent. He had committed no crime in gunning down Trayvon Martin, according to the courts. What about murder in the context of war, an invasion, A genocide. How do we treat murder in these situations? When is murder justified, legally speaking? When is the person who did the killing responsible, and when is the person who ordered the killing responsible? These are difficult questions that are only sometimes, perhaps more accurately, rarely, litigated. With these examples, we can see that even with killing someone, that action is only sometimes considered a crime. Even when the action is wrong, it is not always considered a crime, yet it is a behavior that is of interest to criminologists. We see troubling behavior that isn't charged as a crime all the time. You've seen it in the videos of police brutality in the US, the majority of which don't result in charges being levied. You've read about election fraud or interference, which is undertaken not by powerless individuals, but by powerful entities trying to challenge democracy. At least in the American context, these actions have resulted in few of those involved actually being punished. Then there are the multitudes of white-collar crimes where fancy lawyers can often explain away bad behavior. Even if we're talking about gross negligence, finding accountability is difficult. Maybe you've heard of the Ford Pinto, whose famously fragile gas tank was lampooned in Jim Abrams' Top Secret. The Ford Motor Corporation was charged with criminal homicide, but Ford was found not guilty at trial. Their car apparently was no more dangerous than any other car on the market. So when we think of crime, maybe it's not useful in terms of defining it as a violation of the law, but the social harm that it causes. Luis was telling us about rulemakers in international society, but enforcing rules is tricky, particularly when it comes to human rights violations. The past century alone has seen ample examples of bad behavior, including multiple genocides, political killings, state-sponsored terrorism, torture, and disappearances. Think Australia's above the fray? Well, think again. The Brereton Report documents war crimes allegedly committed by the Australian Defence Force in the war in Afghanistan. Social harm can result from economic crime undertaken by politically connected or rich people who ensure their money doesn't go towards taxes and the social benefits that tax dollars support. Obviously, tax evasion, not paying taxes that you owe, is a crime, but think about tax avoidance. That's a different story. Rich people around the world have several techniques for moving and storing their money in places that reduce their tax liability. It's not a crime. Donald Trump famously boasted about his prowess in avoiding taxes when he campaigned for president. That tax avoidance is not a crime, is not a glitch in the system. Think about who makes the rules and who enforces them. So, where does that leave us as criminologists? It leaves us with a lot of questions that we need to think through. How would you define a criminal? Are you one? Have you ever jaywalked, sped, stolen something, defaced something? That's not that bad. Does that make you a criminal? It's against the law. Should criminality be a permanent state? Why is it that someone has to admit to having been convicted once the sentence is discharged? Think of that adage. Do the crime and do the time. The truth is, however, time never ends once you're convicted. Once a criminal, always a criminal. Is that justice? And I want you to think about one last question. Can you be both criminal and victim at the same time? If so, so what? We'll pick up there next time. Until then, be well.